Great. Well, first of all, thank you, everyone, for the invitation. I'm really honored to be here. And thank you also for all that CSID has done over the past year. The events you've done with Ahmed Najib Shebbi, with Jawhar bin Mubarak, they have been incredibly helpful for keeping us informed about what's happening in Tunisia, hearing from the key players. So really, thank you for all that you've done.
Thank you.
So jumping right into the question, what can the US and the EU do to help restore democracy in Tunisia? In my mind, there are four possible approaches that I'll discuss in turn. The first would be rhetorical pressure and persuasion. In essence, the approach that the international community has taken from July 25th up until April. The second would be a partial suspension of assistance, which the US is embarking on now. The third would be a full suspension of aid. And then the fourth would be trying to leverage the IMF loan to help restore democracy. So let me discuss each of those in turn. So the first approach, the one that the international community has relied on so far, has been public statements expressing concern about Qais Said's actions, as well as private meetings and calls with Qais Said and those around him to try to convince them to be more inclusive and restore democratic institutions. And that approach, in essence, of rhetorical pressure without teeth, that was based in essence on three assumptions that the US and the EU had at the time of the coup. One, that this coup may have been popular. Second, that it wasn't quite clear where it was headed. And third, that maybe as a result, through conversations with Qais Said, maybe we could shape the trajectory back to democracy. I think each of those three assumptions are now moot. In terms of popularity, even if it was popular at first, still minorities deserve rights, deserve political representation. We shouldn't condone a coup against a minority either. But I think what's become clear over the past months is that the honeymoon period for Qais Said is over. He's losing popularity in the polls. Tunisians are fed up with what he is trying to do. They don't see it as important to rewrite the constitution. They want economic growth, not a new political system. There are no signs that they are invested in the process that he is outlining, which all suggests that even if he has some popularity in polls today, he's not actually able to mobilize them towards his roadmap, to participate in the referendum, to participate in the upcoming elections. Those are not the priority for Tunisians. So that first assumption about this being popular is, I think, now moot. The second one, that maybe this, we don't know where this is going, maybe it's short term, maybe he's restoring democracy. This, I think, is also clearly not the case. Instead, over the past 9 months, he's dismantled every democratic institution, from the parliament to the Supreme Judicial Council to the Independent Electoral Commission. He's handpicked a new electoral commission to provide some pseudo-legitimacy for the roadmap moving forward. But this is not an inclusive process that is boding well for a return for democracy. But now onto the third assumption that I think many still hold on to in the administration, which is that preserving some sort of relationship, therefore conversations with Qais Said, could change his mind and restore democracy through persuasion. This, I think, we have seen in the past 9 months is not working. That on the one hand, you could argue maybe these meetings have curbed the most serious excesses, that, you know, he hasn't yet dissolved parties or he hasn't yet cut off US aid to NGOs. But I think we've also seen that there has been a rapid escalation over the last 9 months in terms of dissolving each of those institutions that I mentioned. So it's pretty clear that persuasion is not working, and thus that it's time to reassess what to do in Tunisia. And hence, we turn to the second option, which is the one that the US is now pursuing beginning in April, which is to begin a partial suspension of aid to Tunisia. And here I want to offer a bit of advice on how to make this work, how to get the maximum out of this strategy, if this is the strategy the international community will pursue. And here I want to draw on some lessons from Egypt in 2013, when the US also partially suspended aid after Sisi orchestrated a massacre of protesters. What went wrong there and what lessons can we learn from that experience? The first is that to do a partial aid suspension well, it must be very clear what Tunisia needs to do for that aid to be reinstated. In Egypt, it wasn't quite clear what Sisi needed to do to get that aid back. It wasn't quite, the conditions were not quite made clear. Today, for Tunisia, Tony Blinken, Samantha Power have been quite good at making clear what an inclusive process looks like. They've specified that it needs to include political parties, CSOs, and labor unions, not just labor unions, for instance. They've been clear about expressing concern of military trials. I would say civilian trials against the opposition are also worrisome. But I think in general, this could be made even more clear in terms of what he must do with the upcoming roadmap, namely specifying that international observers must be there to observe the referendum and parliamentary elections, that the electoral commission should be restructured so that it's actually independent and actually political parties therefore view the process as legitimate. Those conditions, I think, should be specified to make partial aid suspension actually work. The second lesson I think we would learn from Egypt is that not everyone in the administration was on the same page back then. At that point, the White House was in favor of cutting aid, but Secretary Kerry, to some extent, Department of Defense, CIA, were all telling Sisi the opposite message, that there wasn't much he needed to do differently for aid to eventually get reinstated. And so in Tunisia's case, it's also clear that everyone in the administration be on the same page about what conditions are needed for aid to be reinstated. We've heard already from White House, State Department, USAID. We haven't yet heard from Department of Defense. And so I worry that perhaps DOD might undercut the effectiveness of this strategy if, for instance, they push for a national security waiver to reinstate the aid, or they increase other pools of funding to try to make up for the reduced FMF funding. So making sure everyone is on the same page would be the second lesson. The third lesson here for a partial aid suspension, and sorry I'm going on a bit long, is to make sure that it is viewed as a credible commitment, that the US is actually serious about not reinstating that aid until the conditions are met. And this is, I think, the critical condition to making an aid suspension work, which is that Sisi, for instance, in Egypt, understood that he didn't need to do much to get the aid reinstated, that he could hold a sham election with just 98% of the vote, and that would be enough. So the worry is that Kais Saied thinks the same, that he can just stick to his roadmap, maybe get one party or two to endorse the process, like the Jabhat al-Shabiya, the People's Movement, for instance, and that might be good enough. And so to make credible the US's commitment to an aid suspension, I would propose that, in essence, the US remove themselves from that decision by delegating it to a third party. In essence, say aid would only be reinstated if international observers actually confirm that this process has been free, fair, and inclusive. So in essence, delegate it to a third party to make it more credible that aid won't be reinstated until these conditions are actually met. All right. Two other strategies I want to briefly introduce, and I believe the other panelists will talk about these as well, which would be first, a full suspension of aid. Here I see two major benefits to pursuing that. One, that it's a larger amount of aid, and so that's more likely, therefore, to shift Kais Saied's calculations. But secondly, that it allows the US, therefore, to declare that this was indeed a coup. Because of the coup clause, we haven't yet said it. That would mandate that any aid to the government be suspended. And so by fully suspending aid, we can call it a coup. Why is that important? I think two reasons. One, because it helps you make that credible commitment. Because of the coup clause, aid cannot be reinstated until there's a democratically elected government back in office. So that at least mitigates some of the commitment problems. But the second reason I think it's important to call it a coup is because it helps to delegitimize the action. Some of the research I've done, just published in Democratization, for instance, shows that if you call an action a coup, public support for it decreases. That survey that we did in Tunisia, for instance, found that 40% would support the military removing the president, but if you called that a coup, it dropped to 20%, a 20 percentage point drop. So that suggests that changing the narrative, calling it a coup, can help also for delegitimizing that action. Finally, let me get to the fourth policy approach, which would be to leverage the IMF negotiations and to add a condition there that a restoration of democracy is critical for the IMF process to proceed. The resistance to this proposal stems in part from a belief that Kais Saied will finally be the one to pursue the economic reforms that the IMF has been hoping for the past 10 years, that he now has the popularity to, in essence, sell these reforms finally to the Tunisian public. And there's a belief that that might happen, and therefore the economic conditions should be the one you focus on, not, for instance, political requirements for the IMF loan. But I think that hope is misplaced. I don't think Kais Saied is the one who's actually going to cut the subsidies to sell off the state-owned enterprises, etc. Partly because he's already losing popularity and so wouldn't want to jeopardize that further, but also because the main supporters he has left are, if we want to characterize them, not the Islamists, not the free market secularists. The main base he has left are the leftist, Arab nationalist, Nasserist types. The parties that are closest to him, for instance, Jabhat al-Sha'biyya, are of that stripe. And so he's not going to lose his main base left by pursuing these economic reforms. And so I would say instead, the more likely condition and the more effective condition would be to restore democracy instead. Finally, before I close, if I may, I just want to make one last point, both for the international community, but also for the Tunisian opposition, which is that Kais Saied needs an off-ramp. He needs some way to still come off as having won, even while democracy gets restored. I think he does still need to have the referendum, pass the referendum, create a new republic so that he comes off as having a win, but still that is a new republic that all find legitimate and actually restores democracy. So I do think it's important for parties to come to the table and find a consensual negotiated solution out of this crisis. Let me stop there. Thanks so much.